The water is on fire. That is the first thing you need to understand about this moment. July 332 BCE, off the coast of what is now Lebanon. The sea itself is lit by burning pitch and sulfur. Orange light is cast onto the faces of men who have fought for 7 months. They have nothing left inside them but rage. On one side, the island city of Tyre, a Phoenician fortress that has never fallen. Walls that rise 150 feet straight out of the water, like the hand of a god reaching up to stop you. Defenders on those walls pour cauldrons of red-hot sand down onto the men below. Sand so hot it pours through gaps in armor and sticks to human skin, burning through flesh, while men scream and tear at their own breastplates, trying to get it off. This is not a metaphor. This actually happened. Ancient historians recorded it because it was so horrifying that no one who witnessed it could stop talking about it. On the other side, Alexander, 24 years old, king of Macedon. At this point in history, he has never lost a battle. He stands on a boarding bridge mounted to the prow of a warship. His ship rams the base of the walls while the men behind him watch and wait for the stone to finally give way. Around him, 223 warships attack from every direction simultaneously. The northern harbor, the southern harbor, and the causeway from the west. The noise is beyond anything a modern person can imagine. Catapults launch 100-pound boulders. Battering rams pound stone in rhythmic, concussive waves as men die in every language spoken around the Mediterranean Sea. And then, the wall cracks. A section of the southern fortification, weakened by weeks of relentless battering, shudders, splits, and collapses into the sea in a cascade of dust and ancient stone. Alexander sees it. Before his officers can say a word, he is already moving forward. 7 months of siege, thousands of men dead. A causeway built literally out of the rubble of another city. 2 enormous siege towers burned to the ground by a fire ship no one saw coming. A navy assembled from scratch in the middle of a war, all of it, every ounce of engineering, diplomacy, stubbornness, and tactical genius that one young Macedonian king could pour into a single objective, came down to this moment. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. Here is the part that separates the Siege of Tyre from every other military achievement of the ancient world. Every military expert alive in 332 BCE agreed on one thing. Tyre could not be taken. To understand how we got here, to this moment of fire, iron, and collapsing walls, we have to go back. Back past the fire ship that nearly ended the entire campaign, back past the causeway, back to the moment when Alexander stood on the mainland shore, looked out at that island half a mile away, and made a decision that people around him genuinely thought was insane. But before we go back, I want to make you a promise about what this story contains, because I think you need to know what you're about to sit with for the next hour. This is the story of a king who literally changed the geography of the earth to win one battle. And the proof is still sitting there in modern Lebanon right now. This is the story of a city that had survived a 13-year siege by the king of Babylon himself, and why that history almost broke Alexander's resolve. This is the story of an engineering project so ambitious that it was immediately copied to build one of the most famous cities in history. And this is the story of a single diplomatic mistake made by the people of Tyre that made a massacre inevitable. Oh, and the most insane part? Alexander almost walked away. Halfway through, with his siege towers in ashes and his men exhausted, he genuinely considered abandoning the whole thing and moving on. What changed his mind is one of the most revealing moments of his entire life. And most people who tell this story skip right past it. So let's go back to the beginning. because great stories deserve to be told from the start. It is November 333 BCE. Alexander the Great has just done something that should have been impossible. At the Battle of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain in what is now southern Turkey, he defeated Darius III, the king of the Persian Empire, the most powerful man on earth, commanding an army that outnumbered the Macedonians by a staggering margin, and not just defeated him, routed him, sent him fleeing from the battlefield in a chariot, abandoning his mother, his wife, and his daughters in his camp. Alexander personally captured the Persian royal family. He treated them with extraordinary courtesy, which was itself a political statement, a message to the entire known world that he was not a barbarian king. He was something new. But here is the thing about Alexander that a lot of people miss when they talk about this period of his life. He was not reckless. He was actually one of the most strategically careful commanders in history, and the decision he made after Issus proves it. Every instinct you might have says, "You just defeated the Persian king in battle, your momentum is incredible, march straight into the Persian heartland and finish it." That's what a reckless conqueror does. Alexander turned south instead. Why? Because he understood something about ancient warfare that is easy to forget. An army is only as powerful as its supply lines. And Alexander's supply lines ran across the Aegean Sea, back to Macedon and Greece. The Persian Empire still possessed the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean, composed largely of Phoenician and Cypriot ships. If Alexander marched east and left that navy intact, those ships could sail behind him, cutting off his supplies, landing troops in Greece, funding rebellions, turning his allies against him. He would be conquering forward while his empire collapsed behind him. So the grand strategy was this: march down the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline, city by city, and capture every port. Strangle the Persian navy by taking away every harbor it could use. Only then, only once the sea was secure, would he turn east toward the Persian heartland. It was, frankly, a brilliant plan, and for a while it worked almost perfectly. Byblos surrendered without a fight. Sidon surrendered without a fight. The cities of the Phoenician coast, one after another, opened their gates and welcomed the young Macedonian king. His reputation alone was enough. After Issus, nobody wanted to be the city that said no to Alexander. Nobody except Tyre. Now, I want to spend a moment on what Tyre actually was, because I think modern audiences dramatically underestimate this city. We think of it today as a historical footnote, a place mentioned in the Bible, a ruin on the Lebanese coast. But in 332 BCE, Tyre was arguably the most important trading city in the world. The Phoenicians had invented the alphabet, the actual ancestor of the letters you are reading right now. Tyre was their crown jewel. Their merchants had founded colonies across the entire Mediterranean, including Carthage, which would one day nearly destroy Rome. Their purple dye, extracted from sea snails and known across the ancient world as Tyrian purple, was so precious that it became the color of royalty for 1,000 years. When people in the ancient world thought of wealth, of maritime power, of civilization itself, they thought of Tyre. I also want to say something about the Tyrian people themselves, because they tend to get flattened into simply the enemy in most tellings of this story, and that flattening is a disservice to history. The Phoenicians were, by 332 BCE, one of the most remarkable civilizations the ancient world had produced. They were not a land empire. They never tried to be. Their power was the sea, a network of trade routes, colonies, and commercial relationships that stretched from Lebanon to Spain. Carthage, which would one day bring Rome to its knees under Hannibal, was a Phoenician colony founded by Tyre. The Phoenicians gave the world its alphabet, not just an alphabet, The alphabet, the direct ancestor of the Greek letters Alexander himself used, the Roman letters his historians wrote in, the English letters you are reading right now. Every time you write anything, you are using a tool that the Phoenicians invented. That is the civilization that stood behind those walls. And Tyre was not on the coast. That is the crucial geographic fact. Tyre was built on an island, approximately half a mile, about 800 meters from the shoreline. Not a large island, but a fortress island. The walls on the eastern face, the side facing the mainland, rose 150 feet straight out of the sea. The city had two natural harbors, one in the north and one in the south, giving it a constant supply line by water that no land-based army could cut. The Persian navy, of which Tyre's own fleet was a major component, had roughly 80 warships stationed there. And history backed up Tyre's confidence. The Assyrians had tried to take it and failed. More importantly, Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, one of the most formidable military commanders of the ancient world, had besieged Tyre for 13 years. 13 years. And in the end, he had to give up. The city had simply waited him out, supplied by sea the entire time. The Tyrians knew their city's history. They had lived inside that history their entire lives. And when Alexander came marching down the coast in late 333 BCE, they looked at their walls and their fleet and their island geography, and they made a calculation. They decided they could do it again. When Alexander approached Tyre, he didn't immediately declare war. He was smarter than that. He sent envoys ahead with what appeared to be a very reasonable request. He wished to enter the Aigum city to make a sacrifice at the temple of Melkart. Now, I need to explain why this was not as innocent as it sounds. Melkart was the patron god of Tyre, the Phoenician deity whom the Greeks identified with their own hero god Heracles. Alexander claimed descent from Heracles on his father's side. Sacrificing at Melkart's temple was therefore both a religious act and a political statement. It was Alexander declaring that this city belongs to the world I am building. The Tyrians were not stupid. They understood exactly what he was asking. Their response was, I have to say, diplomatically masterful. They told Alexander's envoys that they would be happy to do whatever Alexander commanded, and that he was absolutely welcome to sacrifice at the Temple of Heracles. The Temple of Heracles on the mainland, in Old Tyre, the abandoned, undefended, strategically worthless settlement on the shore. Translation: You can have your ceremony, just not in our city, and definitely not in a way that means anything politically. It was the kind of answer that is technically cooperative while being actually defiant, and Alexander saw right through it. He convened a council of war, gathered his generals, and laid out the strategic argument for why Tyre had to be taken before he could advance any further. His generals, to their credit, were not entirely convinced. Some of them pointed out the obvious. Tyre was an island fortress with a fleet and walls that had survived Nebuchadnezzar. They had no navy. The siege could take years. Was it worth it? Alexander gave a speech. We have fragments of it preserved in ancient sources, and even in those fragments, you can hear the voice of someone who has the ability to make other people believe that impossible things are merely difficult. He talked about the strategic necessity of eliminating Persian naval power. He talked about the precedent it would set, that no city on earth could refuse him. And somewhat conveniently, he mentioned that he had recently had a dream in which Heracles himself had taken him by the hand and led him through the gates of Tyre. His court seer, Aristander, declared this a favorable omen. Of course he did. Whether or not Alexander actually had this dream, and I personally think he probably did, because the human mind does remarkable things when it is fixated on a problem, the effect was immediate. The generals agreed. The siege would begin. But before it could formally begin, Alexander made one more attempt at negotiation. He sent heralds to Tyre with a final ultimatum: surrender or face war. The Tyrians killed the heralds. They executed Alexander's ambassadors, walked to the top of their walls, and threw the bodies into the sea. Let me say that again clearly, because the weight of this moment is easy to underestimate. In the ancient world, the person of an ambassador or herald was considered sacred. Even in wars between bitter enemies, you did not kill the messenger. It was one of the oldest and most universal rules of ancient warfare. The Tyrians violated it deliberately, visibly, and publicly. They wanted Alexander to see it. They wanted everyone watching to see it. Why would they do something so provocative? Historians have debated this for centuries, and I think the answer is a combination of genuine defiance and strategic calculation. They were betting that he would recognize Tyre as too costly, too difficult, too time-consuming, that he would take the insult, note it, and move on. They were betting on Nebuchadnezzar. They were betting that history would repeat itself. But here is what I think the Tyrian leadership failed to account for. Nebuchadnezzar was a king with many problems and many fronts. He besieged Tyre for 13 years as one of several ongoing military commitments. Alexander had one problem. He was 23 years old. He had already beaten the Persian Empire's main field army twice, and he had absolutely nothing else on his mind. There is a category of opponent that every defensive strategy underestimates: the one who simply cannot be outlasted because they are not trying to be patient. They are trying to win, and they will not stop trying until they do, or they die. The Tyrians read Alexander through the lens of every conqueror who had come before him. That was the mistake. He wasn't like the others. He never had been. It was the worst bet anyone made in the 4th century BCE. Alexander was enraged, genuinely, personally enraged. And that rage was politically useful to him. He turned to his army and said, in effect, "They have given us no choice, and they have shown us who they are." The moral case for siege had been handed to him, gift-wrapped. The Siege of Tyre began in January 332 BCE. Alexander's first problem was simple and total. You cannot besiege an island with a land army. There were 800 meters of open Mediterranean Sea between him and those walls, and the Tyrian fleet controlled every inch of it. His options, theoretically, were to blockade the city and starve it out, or to build a navy and attack from the water. He had no navy, and the two harbors on Tyre's northern and southern sides meant that a blockade without naval superiority was essentially useless. Ships would simply sail in and out freely. So Alexander proposed something that, when you first hear it, sounds less like military strategy and more like the plan of a man who has simply refused to accept that physics applies to him. He was going to fill in the sea. He was going to build a land bridge, a causeway, what ancient sources call a mole, stretching from the mainland all the way to the island. 800 meters of open water turned into a road wide enough for siege equipment. His engineers walked the site. The seafloor near the mainland shore was shallow, only a few feet deep, with a muddy bottom that was workable. It became significantly deeper as you approached the island, reaching 18 feet near the city walls, with a sharp drop in the seafloor. This was going to be an engineering challenge on a scale the ancient world had rarely attempted. But Alexander had two things going for him: an essentially unlimited supply of construction material, and an army that believed he could do anything. The construction material came from Old Tyre, the abandoned mainland settlement whose stones Alexander had already occupied. His engineers began systematically demolishing whatever remained of the old city: buildings, walls, foundations, roads. Every stone went into the sea. For timber, he sent parties into the famous cedar forests of Lebanon, the same forests that had supplied timber for Solomon's temple 5 centuries earlier. The Lebanese cedars were massive, ancient trees, and Alexander's men cut them down and drove them into the seabed like enormous tent stakes, creating the framework and palisades of the causeway structure. He also did something that very few commanders of his era would have done. He went to the work site himself. He picked up stones. He carried them to the water's edge. And his soldiers, watching their 24-year-old king doing manual labor, responded the way soldiers always respond when a leader genuinely shares their hardship, with an enthusiasm that bordered on the fanatical. Ancient sources describe the army competing with each other in the work, shouting and singing, the whole project transformed from military labor into something that felt almost like a collective act of will against the sea itself. Think about what that scene actually looked like. Tens of thousands of soldiers and conscripted laborers demolishing an entire city stone by stone and dumping it into the Mediterranean. The air is full of dust from the demolition crews, the constant splash of rocks hitting water, and the rhythmic pounding of men driving cedar stakes into the seabed, horses hauling loaded carts to the water's edge and turning back for another load, engineers measuring depth, calculating angles, shouting corrections, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a young king in his work clothes, carrying a stone that any servant could have carried for him, because he understood that the most important thing he could build that day was not the causeway. It was the belief in his men that this was possible. For a while, it went remarkably well. The shallow water near the mainland filled quickly. The mole grew day by day, pushing out into the channel, and the Tyrians watched from their walls with what must have been a mixture of disbelief and growing unease. They had expected Alexander to give up when he saw the geography. They had expected him to recognize the problem as unsolvable. Instead, he was solving it, slowly, laboriously, but undeniably. When Tyre finally understood what was happening, they responded. Tyrian warships swung close to the growing causeway and raked the construction crews with arrows and missile fire. Catapults on the city walls launched boulders onto the mole, crushing workers and destroying the structural work. Progress slowed dramatically. Men died every day doing what was essentially construction work. Alexander's answer was to build 2 enormous siege towers at the leading edge of the causeway. Towers 160 feet tall, the largest of their kind ever constructed, covered in rawhide to resist fire arrows. The towers were mounted with catapults at the top and heavy ballistae below, creating elevated artillery platforms that could suppress the defenders on Tyre's walls and fight off the Tyrian ships. They worked. For a period, the construction pace picked up again. The mole crept forward. The gap to the island narrowed. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like Alexander's mad plan might actually work. And then the Tyrians built a fire ship. I want you to picture the engineering of what Tyre did next, because it is one of the most creative acts of military destruction in ancient history. They took an old horse transport vessel, a large, heavy ship, the kind used to carry cavalry horses across water. They stripped it down and filled the hull with every combustible material they could find: dried branches, chaff, torches, pitch, sulfur. Then they hung cauldrons from double yardarms on the masts, cauldrons filled with a volatile, flammable oil, positioned so that when the masts eventually burned through and fell, the cauldrons would tip and pour their burning contents across the deck and whatever was below it. They weighted the stern of the ship heavily so that the bow lifted clear of the water, meaning when the ship was driven forward, it would ride up onto the causeway rather than simply striking it. They soaked all the rigging in oil. Every sail, every rope, Every wooden surface that could carry fire was prepared to carry fire. On a windy day, specifically chosen for the wind direction, 2 Tyrian galleys took the fireship under tow and aimed it at the end of the causeway. The crews rowed hard, building speed. When they were close enough, they lit the fireship and cut the tow lines. Then they dove into the water and swam for safety. The bow drove up onto the mole exactly as designed. What followed was described by ancient eyewitnesses as an immediate and total inferno. The pitch and sulfur caught simultaneously. The cauldrons swung, the masts burned, the oil poured. Both of Alexander's 160-foot towers caught fire at the base and burned from the ground up. These massive wooden structures, months in the building, becoming pillars of fire visible for miles in every direction. Under the cover of the blaze and the chaos, a fleet of small Tyrian boats rowed out from the city and landed on the causeway at multiple points. Tyrian soldiers engaged the panicking Macedonian crews, cut down anyone who tried to fight the fires, and systematically destroyed every piece of siege equipment that hadn't already been caught. The palisades along the edges of the mole were torn down. The catapults were smashed. The towers collapsed into the sea. When the smoke cleared, the end of the causeway was a field of ash and broken timber. Months of labor, gone in an afternoon. Now here is the moment that defines Alexander the Great as something genuinely different from other commanders. Any rational assessment of the situation after the fireship would have concluded that the mole strategy was fundamentally flawed, that wooden towers on a causeway would always be vulnerable to this kind of attack, and that without naval superiority, nothing built on that mole could be protected. A different commander might have regrouped, reconsidered, perhaps found a face-saving way to call the siege a strategic withdrawal and move on. Alexander ordered the causeway to be widened and rebuilt, with more towers. Not the same plan. A better version of the same plan. The width increase was significant. It meant more artillery platforms, more capacity for defensive structures, more room to protect the siege engines. And simultaneously, Alexander made the decision that changed everything. He acknowledged for the first time that he needed a navy, not as a supplement to the land strategy, as the primary instrument of victory. He left the siege in the hands of his subordinates and rowed north to Sidon to collect ships. I think people underestimate how significant this was. Alexander, the man whose identity was built around aggressive forward momentum, deliberately paused his campaign to address a fundamental weakness. That takes a kind of self-awareness that is rare in anyone, let alone a 24-year-old king who had never lost a battle and probably had every reason to believe he never would. There is a leadership lesson buried in this moment that I find more valuable than anything taught in most management books. When something fails catastrophically, there are 2 responses available to you. The first is to defend the original decision, to find external causes for the failure, to blame the fireship and the wind direction and bad luck, and to try the same thing again with minor adjustments. The second is to ask what the failure actually revealed about the assumptions underneath the original plan, and to fix the assumptions rather than the surface problem. Alexander did the second thing. He didn't say, "Those towers burned because we didn't guard them well enough." He said, "Those towers burned because we don't control the water around them, and we don't control the water because we have no navy, and that is the actual problem." 2 months later, he came back with 223 ships. The fireship didn't break Alexander. It educated him. And that distinction between a commander who is broken by failure and one who is educated by it is the difference between a conqueror and a legend. Alexander's departure for Sidon was not just a military logistics mission. It was a masterpiece of ancient diplomacy conducted at speed. His victories at the Granicus River and Issus had already shifted the political winds of the eastern Mediterranean. City-states and kingdoms that had previously aligned with Persia out of necessity were now quietly recalculating. Alexander understood this, and he worked it. He sent word to every Phoenician city whose fleet had previously served the Persian navy: Byblos, Aradus, and the cities of Cyprus. His message was simple. You have already surrendered to me. Your ships now serve me. Contribute them to the Siege of Tyre. The response was remarkable. Ships came from Byblos, from Aradus, from Rhodes, from Lycia, from Cilicia. The Macedonian fleet sent vessels from the Aegean. Then came the development that truly changed the strategic picture. The king of Cyprus, who had been watching Alexander's string of victories with growing fascination and pragmatic self-interest, sent 120 war galleys to Sidon, 120 ships, more than Alexander had gathered from all other sources combined. 23 more arrived from the Ionian Greek city-states. When Alexander returned to Tyre, he commanded 223 warships. He had arrived at the siege of an island fortress with no navy. He was returning with the largest fleet assembled in the eastern Mediterranean since the Persian Wars 50 years earlier. The Tyrian fleet numbered approximately 80 ships. The math was suddenly very different. Alexander moved quickly. His fleet sailed on Tyre and blockaded both harbors simultaneously. The Cyprian contingent sealing the northern harbor, the Phoenician allies sealing the southern. No ship entered or left Tyre. The island that had been invulnerable because of the sea was now imprisoned by it. 7 months of supplies, whatever the city had stored, would now have to last indefinitely. No reinforcements from Carthage, the promised fleet never came, a fact that the Tyrians must have felt as a particular kind of abandonment. They were alone. I want to linger on that Carthaginian failure for a moment, because it tells you something important about the political reality of the ancient Mediterranean in 332 BCE. Carthage was Tyre's most powerful colony, a city that would eventually build an empire of its own, that would give Rome its most terrifying enemy in Hannibal. They had promised ships to their mother city. And when the moment came, when Tyre was surrounded and desperate and needed that promise honored, Carthage sent nothing. The reasons are debated by historians. Some argue Carthage was occupied with its own wars in Sicily, others that the Carthaginian leadership simply made a cold calculation that Tyre was already lost. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Tyre died alone, watching the horizon for sails that never appeared. There is something genuinely tragic about that, independent of everything else in this story. Meanwhile, the causeway, widened now, more heavily fortified, continued to grow. Alexander had several of his slower galleys retrofitted as battering ram platforms, positioning them to strike the walls directly from the water. When his engineers discovered that the Tyrians had placed large stone blocks on the seabed beneath the walls to prevent the ships from getting close enough, Alexander had crane ships deployed to lift the stones out of the water and clear the approach. When the Tyrians sent out underwater swimmers at night to cut the anchor cables of the ram ships, Alexander switched from ropes to iron chains. Every Tyrian countermeasure was met with an adaptation. The siege had become an engineering competition between two extraordinarily creative adversaries, and Alexander was determined to win every round. There is something I find genuinely thrilling about this phase of the siege, and I want to pause on it for a moment. Think about what the Tyrians were doing. These were not just soldiers following orders. These were engineers, sailors, craftsmen, divers, ordinary people defending their city with extraordinary ingenuity. They were inventing solutions to problems that had never existed before, because no one had ever attacked a city quite the way Alexander was attacking them. The underwater divers cutting anchor cables, That is brilliant. That is creative, dangerous, skilled work done in the dark water under enemy ships. I have genuine respect for the defenders of Tyre, even knowing how this story ends. They fought harder and smarter than almost any city in history, but they were running out of time, and they were running out of options. There is a particular kind of creativity that only emerges when people are truly cornered, when every normal option has been exhausted, and the only thing left is the imagination of people who have nothing to lose. Tyre entered that state sometime in the spring of 332 BCE, and what they came up with is extraordinary and, in some cases, deeply disturbing. The red-hot sand was already in use. Let me make sure you understand how terrible this weapon was. The Tyrians heated sand in large bronze shields over fires until it was glowing, essentially superheated granular material with no water content, nothing to extinguish it. Then they released it from the walls above the ships and men below. It floated on the air currents, drifting down in a cloud of invisible burning particles, and because it was granular and fine, it found every gap: the collar of a breastplate, the edge of a helmet, the space between armor segments. Once inside the clothing, it clung to the skin. It could not be brushed off quickly. It could not be washed off in the middle of a battle. The soldiers below were being burned alive inside their own armor, and they couldn't stop fighting long enough to remove it. The Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, writing centuries later from earlier Greek sources, said that none of Tyre's defensive weapons aroused more terror than this. The Tyrians also reportedly mounted spinning wheels on their walls, mechanical devices designed to rotate at high speed and deflect the bolts from Macedonian catapults. Whether this actually worked the way ancient sources describe is a matter of historical debate, but the fact that they were trying it tells you everything about the innovation pressure inside that city. They were experimenting. They were testing new ideas every day. The city was effectively running a weapons development program under siege conditions. The Tyrian navy made one last major attempt to break the blockade. This is one of my favorite moments in the entire siege, not because of the outcome, the Tyrians lost, but because of the audacity of the plan. They had observed that Alexander himself returned to the mainland every afternoon around the same time to eat and rest, and that during this window, much of the Cyprian fleet blockading the northern harbor was undermanned, with crews eating their own meals on the ships or relaxing on the decks. So they prepared 13 of their best warships, carefully selected crews, the finest oarsmen and marines available. They hung sails across the mouth of the northern harbor to conceal their preparations. In the midday heat of the Mediterranean summer, in complete silence, they rowed out in a single file, timing their exit to the moment of maximum Macedonian inattention. They achieved total surprise. The first Tyrian ship hit the Cyprian blockade line like a hammer. They were outnumbered eventually, but in those first minutes, their discipline and preparation gave them a ferocious advantage. They drove into the Cyprian ships screaming war cries, smashing oars, killing crews. Several Macedonian and Cyprian ships were sunk or badly damaged in those first moments. Alexander was not at lunch. He had skipped his afternoon rest. That day, ancient sources don't tell us why, whether by instinct or information or pure coincidence, and when the fighting started in the northern harbor, he was already moving. He personally led a counterattack with the fastest ships available. The Tyrian sortie, which had been going remarkably well, suddenly found Alexander coming at them from the flank. The advantage evaporated. Most of the sortie ships were sunk or captured. The Tyrians who survived retreated to the harbor. It was the last offensive action the Tyrian fleet would take. And I think that sortie, the courage of those 13 ships, the careful planning, the almost success of it, deserves to be remembered as one of the great military gambles of the ancient world. They came genuinely close. Had Alexander actually been at lunch that day, the Cyprian blockade line might have shattered, and the entire strategic picture of the siege might have shifted. History turns on these moments more than we like to admit. One meal eaten or not eaten. One man who decided to keep working instead of resting. The distance between those two outcomes is sometimes nothing more than a coincidence of timing. And then came the darkest moment of the siege from a purely human standpoint. Sometime in these final weeks, the Tyrians began executing Macedonian prisoners, men captured in earlier fighting, on the top of their walls, in full view of Alexander's army watching from the causeway and the ships below. The bodies were thrown from the walls into the sea. The soldiers watching from below understood exactly what this meant. The Tyrian leadership had made a calculation. There was no negotiated outcome available to them anymore. Alexander was going to take the city one way or another. Surrender meant death or slavery for everyone. So they chose to defy him to the last breath. And they chose to make that defiance as visible and as painful as possible. It was a brave choice. It was also a choice that guaranteed what would come next. After you hit someone that hard, after you kill their ambassadors and execute their prisoners in public, you have removed every restraint that civilization imposes on the violence of war. Alexander's army was no longer just soldiers following a campaign objective. They were men who had watched their friends die on those walls for 7 months. Men who had built a causeway with their hands out of the rubble of a city. Men who had seen their towers burn. And now they had watched their captured brothers be killed in front of them. The mercy that Alexander could have chosen to show, and he was capable of mercy, he demonstrated it repeatedly in his campaigns, had been made politically and personally impossible. If you are enjoying this story, drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of Alexander's campaigns you find most fascinating: the military engineering, the psychology, or the sheer scale of what he attempted. I read every comment, and your thoughts actually shape what stories I cover next. By late July of 332 BCE, the Siege of Tyre had been grinding for 7 months. Alexander's army was exhausted in a way that goes beyond physical tiredness, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from months of siege warfare, which is psychologically brutal in ways that open-field battle is not. In a battle, the violence is concentrated, intense, and then it ends. In a siege, you die a little every day. You watch your friends get injured by rocks dropped from walls. You breathe smoke and dust. You go to sleep every night knowing that tomorrow will be the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that. The momentum that had been Alexander's greatest weapon since he crossed into Persia had been completely neutralized. He could not maneuver. He could not think his way to a quick victory. He could only push day after day against a city that refused to break. Several of his generals came to him with an argument that was, strategically speaking, not entirely unreasonable. Egypt was waiting. The Persian Empire's richest province, a place that would almost certainly open its gates without a significant fight, was sitting to the south. Leaving Tyre with a garrison, acknowledging that the city was effectively neutralized by the blockade, even if not taken, and moving on, this was a legitimate military option. It preserved momentum. It denied Tyre the psychological victory of having stopped him, while not wasting more lives on a city that was already strangled. Alexander listened to them. And then he said no. His reasoning, as recorded by Arrian, was partly strategic. He genuinely believed that leaving the siege incomplete would create problems down the road. But there was something else in it too. Something personal. He had been told by the best military minds of his generation that this could not be done. He had watched his towers burn. He had been mocked by the people on those walls. He had built a road across the sea with his own hands, and he was not going to leave. I find this moment more revealing than any of his great battlefield victories. At Issus, at Granicus, Alexander was doing what he was born to do, charging into the enemy line, leading cavalry in the decisive moment, winning through speed and aggression and personal courage. This was different. This was choosing to continue something hard, unglamorous, and expensive when a reasonable exit was available. That is a different kind of strength. That is will, not talent. Then came the prophecy incident, which is either one of the most charming moments in ancient history or a perfect window into how Alexander managed the psychological state of his army, depending on your perspective. His court seer, Aristander, performed a divination and announced that the omens were favorable, that Tyre would fall before the month of July ended. The army received this announcement with something between tired hope and open derision, because by this point it was already July 30th. There was one day left in the month. Even if you believed in omens, the timing was problematic. Alexander's solution was immediate and completely unapologetic. He simply declared that July 30th was not, in fact, July 30th. It was July 28th. He had the official calendar of the campaign adjusted. The proclamation went out. Today is the 28th. Aristander's prophecy therefore remained valid. Tyre would fall before the end of July. They had 2 days left. His officers must have exchanged looks, but nobody argued, because the point was not the date. The point was that their king stood in front of them after 7 months and told them, "We are 2 days away. This is when it ends." And somehow, because he was Alexander, and because he had never told them something like that and been wrong, they believed him. He assembled the army and the fleet for a coordinated final assault of a scale and complexity that had never been attempted in ancient warfare. The plan was to attack Tyre from every possible direction simultaneously so that the defenders could not concentrate their forces at any single point. The causeway would deliver battering rams and siege towers to the south wall. The fleet would attack the northern and southern harbors with warships equipped with boarding bridges. Additional ships would attack the walls directly with rams, catapults on ships, and the causeway would suppress the defenders continuously, preventing them from organizing effective resistance. The assault began. The rams on the causeway found their breach point on the southern wall, the same section that had been weakened over weeks of battering, and began the final sustained assault. The stone began to crack, then to shift. The fleet, with Alexander at the front of the boarding formation on the lead ship, pressed the harbor entrances. The Tyrians fought with everything they had left: the hot sand, the stones, the arrows, the last desperate courage of people who had already decided how this ends. I want you to pause for a second and feel the weight of what the Tyrian defenders were experiencing in those final hours. These were men who had watched their city get slowly strangled for 7 months. Men who had sent their wives and children away to Carthage months earlier, not knowing if they would ever see them again. Men who had fought brilliantly: the fire ship, the hot sand, the sortie, the underwater saboteurs, and had come agonizingly close to breaking Alexander's will. Now they were standing in breaches in their own walls, fighting with whatever weapons remained, knowing in the back of their minds that the mathematics had finally run out. I have genuine respect for that. Not every great act of courage in history belongs to the winner. Then the southern wall collapsed. The breach was perhaps 30 feet wide. Not wide enough for a comfortable advance, not wide enough to pour through easily. It was a killing ground, a narrow gap in stone with defenders on both sides and above, and the first men through it died. They were pushed aside, physically pushed aside by the men coming behind them, stepping over bodies, and the wave continued. Alexander's boarding bridges reached the top of the walls from the sea. Macedonian soldiers who had been climbing those walls for 7 months were suddenly on top of them. Alexander himself came through the breach. Ancient sources are specific about this. He was in the first wave, sword drawn, personally in the street fighting. His bodyguards could barely keep up with him. He was 24 years old, and he had just done what Nebuchadnezzar could not do in 13 years. He was not going to watch from a safe distance. The city fell street by street. The Tyrians fought in their doorways and on their rooftops. Some locked themselves in their houses and chose their own deaths rather than surrender. Some charged into the Macedonian soldiers with nothing but the intention to die, taking someone with them. The ancient sources describe the fighting as extraordinarily brutal on both sides. 7 months of siege warfare had stripped away every pretense of civilization from both armies. This was not a battle anymore. This was something older and uglier. And then, somewhere in the chaos of the final assault, Alexander found his way to the Temple of Melkart, the sacrifice he had asked for politely months ago. The sacrifice the Tyrians had refused him. He performed it. Surrounded by the burning city, with the sounds of the final fighting still audible in the streets, the 24-year-old king of Macedon made his offering to the god of the city he had just destroyed. I don't know whether that strikes you as triumphant or terrible. For me, it's both. And I think Alexander intended it to be both. The numbers that come out of the fall of Tyre are among the most brutal in Alexander's entire campaign, and it is worth sitting with them for a moment rather than moving past them quickly. 8,000 Tyrian fighters were killed during the final assault and the street fighting that followed. 6,000 more were slaughtered inside the city after the fighting effectively ended. These were not combat deaths. They were executions carried out by soldiers who had been told, in essence, that the rules had been suspended. 2,000 Tyrian men, survivors who had been taken prisoner, were crucified on the beach. 2,000 crosses stretching along the Phoenician shoreline, visible from the sea, visible from the mainland, visible to every ship that passed. Alexander intended this image to be seen. It was a message written in human beings, addressed to every city between here and Egypt. This is what defiance costs. 30,000 of the remaining population, primarily women, children, and non-combatants, were sold into slavery. In the context of ancient warfare, this was not unusual. It was, in fact, the standard outcome for a city taken by storm after a prolonged siege. The ancient world's rules about mercy were essentially this: if you surrendered early, you might be treated generously. If you forced a siege, you forfeited the rights that peaceful capitulation would have bought you. Tyre had not merely forced a siege. Tyre had killed ambassadors, executed prisoners in public, and fought for 7 months. By the standards of the ancient world, the response was proportionate. I say that not to endorse it. I say it to provide context, because I think it is intellectually dishonest to judge ancient warfare by modern standards without acknowledging that those standards didn't exist yet. Does that make the crucifixions less horrifying to a modern eye? No. But it makes them comprehensible in a way that sheer condemnation doesn't. And here is the thing that I find genuinely complicated about Alexander as a historical figure, the thing that I keep wrestling with. Every time I revisit this period, he was not uniquely cruel by the standards of his time. He was, in many cases, notably more merciful than his contemporaries. At Issus, he treated the Persian royal family with extraordinary respect. At other points in his campaign, he showed clemency that surprised and impressed the people receiving it. But at Tyre, and later at other cities that pushed him to this point, he was capable of something that can only be described as organized, deliberate savagery. Not in the heat of battle, but as a policy decision made after the fighting had ended. That contrast between the man who courteously cared for Darius's captured daughters and the man who ordered 2,000 crosses on a beach is not a contradiction. It is a portrait of someone who understood both mercy and brutality as instruments, and chose between them based on what the situation required. That is its own kind of frightening. There was mercy, too. Those who reached the temple of Melkart before the soldiers caught them were declared protected, sanctuary honored. This group included King Azamilchus himself and his family, as well as a number of Tyrian nobles and prominent citizens. Alexander granted them their lives. They had obeyed the oldest law of the ancient world, the protection of those who seek refuge in sacred spaces, and Alexander, whatever else he was in this moment, was not irreligious. And then there is the story that I find the most quietly moving in this entire account. Among Alexander's army were soldiers from Sidon, a Phoenician city-state just up the coast from Tyre. The Sidonians and the Tyrians were, in the deepest sense, the same people. Same language, same gods, same ancestors, same culture. The Sidonians had submitted to Alexander and were technically his soldiers. But as they moved through the fallen city, they recognized what surrounded them: Phoenician homes, Phoenician temples, Phoenician faces. And quietly, without orders, without authorization, they began hiding Tyrian survivors on their ships. 15,000 people, according to the ancient sources, were secretly taken aboard Sidonian vessels and smuggled to Sidon, where they lived out their lives as free people. Nobody officially noticed this, or if they noticed, nobody chose to make an issue of it. I think Alexander may have tacitly permitted it. He was shrewd enough to understand that a gesture of mercy, even an unofficial one, had political value in a region he was trying to incorporate into his empire. Or maybe it simply happened in the chaos of the aftermath, beyond any single person's control. 15,000 people who should have been slaves, alive and free, because sailors from a rival city-state remembered that blood matters more than politics. In a story filled with extraordinary acts of military prowess, that strikes me as one of the genuinely human moments, the kind of thing that doesn't appear in strategy textbooks, but that keeps history from being only a record of destruction. Alexander appointed a Macedonian governor, installed a garrison, and performed his long-delayed sacrifice at the Temple of Melkart. Then he turned south, toward Gaza, toward Egypt, toward the next impossibility on his list. Here is the thing about Alexander's causeway that stops me every time I think about it. It is still there. Right now, in modern Lebanon, on the coast south of Beirut, there is a peninsula where an island used to be. The city of Tyre, called Sur in Arabic, sits on a tombolo, a geographic feature formed when a land bridge connects an island to the mainland. That tombolo is the direct descendant of Alexander's mole. The stones he dumped into the sea in 332 BCE created an obstruction that altered the currents and the longshore drift of sand along that coast. Over the centuries following the siege, sand accumulated against and on top of the causeway structure, building up layer by layer, century by century, until the 800 meters of open water had become solid ground. Alexander didn't just change who controlled Tyre, he changed the shape of the coastline. He literally rearranged the geography of the Earth, and the Earth has kept it that way for 2,350 years. Geologists who have studied the site confirm this. The sandy isthmus that connects Tyre to the Lebanese mainland today follows exactly the line of the ancient causeway. The northern and southern harbors of ancient Tyre, both eventually silted up as a result of the altered currents, have been found by archaeologists exactly where historical sources said they would be. The southern harbor was only established in 2019. The physical evidence of that siege is still being discovered. Let that breathe for a second. In 2019, less than a decade ago, Archaeologists were still finding physical evidence of what Alexander built in 332 BCE. A breakwater along the southern coast of modern Tyre, matching Phoenician construction style, protects the harbor basin that ancient historians described. 2,350 years of sediment, and the bones of the siege are still there underneath it. History is not always buried as deeply as we think. Sometimes it is just waiting for someone to look. The strategic consequences were almost immediate and almost total. Without Tyre, the Persian navy had no major base on the eastern Mediterranean. The remaining Persian naval presence, ships without a home port, without safe harbor, without the ability to resupply or coordinate, dissolved. When Alexander turned south toward Egypt, he faced no naval threat whatsoever. Egypt, knowing this and knowing Alexander's reputation, surrendered without significant resistance. He was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, crowned pharaoh, and founded Alexandria, a city that would become the greatest center of knowledge in the ancient world. And here is a detail that I love. Alexandria was built on exactly the same engineering principle as the Tyre causeway. The island of Pharos, where the famous lighthouse would eventually stand, was connected to the mainland by a structure called the Heptastadium, a causeway that created the two harbors of ancient Alexandria. Alexander learned the principle of harbor construction through the causeway at Tyre and immediately applied it to build his greatest city. The technique that destroyed one city built another. Then there is the question of what would have happened if Tyre had held. I want to spend a moment on this counterfactual because I think it genuinely matters. If Tyre had maintained its resistance, if Alexander had been forced to give up and move on, the city would have remained the operational base for whatever Persian naval forces remained after Issus. Those forces could have sailed to the Aegean and supported a rebellion in Greece, where many city-states were not exactly enthusiastic about Macedonian dominance. They could have disrupted Alexander's supply lines across the Aegean. They could have provided a rallying point for the Persian resistance that might have made Gaugamela, the great battle where Alexander finally broke the Persian Empire, significantly more difficult or even impossible. The fall of Tyre was not just a military victory. It was the moment when Alexander's entire eastern campaign became strategically viable in a way it had never been before. And then there is the biblical dimension, which I think deserves mention because it adds a layer to this story that goes beyond pure military history. The prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BCE, roughly 250 years before the siege, described the eventual destruction of Tyre in terms that ancient readers found strikingly specific when Alexander's siege actually happened. Ezekiel wrote of Tyre's stones being thrown into the midst of the sea, of the city, becoming bare rock, and of many nations coming against it. Whether you read this as genuine prophecy, as allegorical literature, or as a coincidence shaped by Tyre's historically precarious position, the fact that Alexander effectively fulfilled this description by demolishing old Tyre and throwing its stones into the sea added a dimension to his reputation that was not lost on ancient observers. To some, it seemed like the universe had been waiting for him. I am not a religious person, so I will not push that interpretation. But I will say this. The Siege of Tyre is one of those events in history where the scale of what one person accomplished is genuinely difficult to process. A man looked at an island fortress that had survived 13 years of Babylonian siege, that had walls rising from the sea, that possessed a fleet and 2 safe harbors, and decided he was going to connect it to the mainland, eliminate its fleet, blockade it from both sides, and break it, with no navy, no existing plan, and no precedent to follow. And he did it in 7 months. If that doesn't make you want to drop a like on this video and subscribe for more stories like this, I genuinely don't know what will. Alexander was 23 years old when this siege began. 24 when it ended. I keep coming back to that fact because it is so difficult to integrate with everything else we know about this campaign. Think about what the Siege of Tyre required of him, because it was fundamentally different from everything that had made him famous before it. The victories at the Granicus River and at Issus were won through speed, aggression, and personal courage, Alexander charging into the enemy line, leading from the front, winning battles in hours through a combination of tactical brilliance and physical fearlessness. Those victories played to his greatest strengths. The Siege of Tyre required the opposite skill set. It required patience, 7 months of patience from a man whose entire identity was built around forward momentum. It required adaptability, the willingness to acknowledge that his initial strategy was insufficient and pivot to a completely different approach. It required the management of an army's morale over a prolonged, grinding, unglamorous slog that offered none of the glory of open battle. And it required something else that I think is underappreciated: the willingness to build. Alexander's reputation is built almost entirely on destruction: cities taken, armies broken, empires dismantled. But the Siege of Tyre was fundamentally an act of creation. He built a road, he built a navy, he built new siege equipment from scratch after the old equipment burned. He built the infrastructure of his own victory out of materials that didn't exist as military assets when he arrived. The causeway that still exists in Lebanon today is not a monument to destruction. It is a monument to the human capacity to decide that a problem will be solved, and to keep working until it is. The July 28th incident, the date that wasn't the 28th, is the moment I always use when I'm trying to explain Alexander to people who haven't studied him closely. It shows you the thing that made him extraordinary, which has nothing to do with military genius. He understood that an army is not a machine. It is a collection of human beings with emotions, fears, hopes, and the need to believe that what they are doing matters and that it will end well. The seer's prophecy was failing because of a calendar problem, and Alexander simply fixed the calendar. His men knew he was doing it. They didn't care. They needed to believe the end was 2 days away, and he gave them that belief. That is leadership of a kind that transcends tactics. But I want to end with the darkness too, because I think this story demands it. 2,000 crosses on a beach. 30,000 people were sold into slavery. A city burning. These are not abstractions. They are the price that was paid for Alexander's refusal to accept that something could not be done. The same will that built the causeway and assembled the fleet and pushed through to the breach, that same will ordered the crucifixions. The man who picked up stones alongside his soldiers and inspired them through 7 months of impossible work is the same man who made sure the beach was lined with crosses so that every sailor on the Mediterranean would know what defiance cost. I don't think you can fully admire Alexander without fully reckoning with that, and I don't think you can fully condemn him without reckoning with what he built. Not just the causeway, but the world that came after him, the spread of the Greek language and culture across the Middle East, the libraries of Alexandria, the blending of civilizations that his conquests catalyzed and that shaped the ancient world for centuries. History's most consequential figures are rarely simple. Alexander the Great is not simple. He is the most complex figure I have ever spent time with, and I have spent a lot of time with him. Every time I think I have him figured out, every time I think I can put him neatly in one category or another, he does something that destroys the category. The man who wept at the tomb of Achilles, the man who ordered 2,000 crosses, the man who carried stones on a causeway alongside his soldiers, the man who crossed a desert that killed 1/3 of his army, not because military necessity required it, but because the Queen of the Amazons had supposedly crossed it once, and he needed to know if he could. He was heroic and terrible and brilliant and reckless and disciplined and wildly, dangerously human. The Siege of Tyre is the story that most completely captures all of those things at once: the patience and the rage, the engineering brilliance and the organizational chaos, the personal courage and the policy brutality, the victory that changed the world and the cost that should give. That victory pause. When you stand on the peninsula that used to be an island, and you look east towards the Lebanese hills and west towards the open Mediterranean, you are standing on the physical record of what one human being decided he would not accept as an obstacle. 2,300 years of sand and time and civilization built on top of the decision of a 24-year-old king who looked at the sea and said, "No." Tyre had walls, an ocean, history, and time on its side. Alexander had one thing that none of those could stop: the absolute, total, unshakable refusal to accept that something cannot be done. And here, 2,300 and some years later, you can drive to the coast of Lebanon and stand on the ground he built and look at the sea on either side of you and understand exactly what that means. That's the story of the Siege of Tyre. If this video gave you something, if it made you think differently about what human beings are capable of, or what the cost of ambition looks like, or just what it felt like to be standing on that causeway in 332 BCE, then the best thing you can do is share it with someone who would appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me your take on Alexander, hero, monster, or something in between. There is no wrong answer, and genuinely, the conversations in the comments on these videos are some of the most interesting discussions I have anywhere online. I'll see you in the next one.